Have you ever achieved something you genuinely worked hard for, something no one handed you, and felt, underneath the congratulations, a quiet, persistent suspicion that you'd somehow gotten away with something? Not pride, not relief, just a low hum of dread, waiting for the moment someone finally notices you don't actually belong where you've ended up. Most people call this imposter syndrome and treat it as a confidence problem, something you're supposed to fix by simply believing in yourself more. Carl Jung would have looked at it very differently. Not as a failure of self-esteem, but as a very specific kind of gap. The distance between the image of yourself that other people now believe and the self underneath it that hasn't yet caught up to believing it too. Number 1. Imposter syndrome isn't really about competence. It's about the widening gap between your persona and your sense of self. Jung described the persona as the mask a person builds to function well in the world, competent, capable, worthy of the roles they occupy. For most people, that mask develops gradually enough that the inner sense of self has time to grow alongside it. But for people who advance quickly, through talent, effort, or simply being placed in demanding situations before they felt ready, the persona can race ahead of the self, built and rewarded faster than the internal sense of legitimacy that's supposed to support it. There was a man I'll call Desmond who was promoted rapidly at a young age, based on genuinely excellent work. From the outside, everything about his position made complete sense, but privately, he described a specific, persistent feeling that everyone around him was responding to a version of him that felt slightly ahead of who he actually was on the inside, and that the gap between the two would eventually be discovered. Jung wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself, as well as others, think one is." Desmond's dread wasn't really about whether he was good at his job. It was the discomfort of a mask that had outpaced the internal sense of self required to wear it comfortably. Number 2. This is why competence rarely resolves the feeling, because the feeling was never actually about competence to begin with. One of the most frustrating aspects of imposter syndrome, for the people experiencing it, is how little it responds to actual evidence. More achievements arrive, more proof accumulates. And the feeling doesn't shrink. Sometimes it grows louder instead. This confuses people because they assume the discomfort is a rational response to uncertain ability, something more success should logically resolve. But Jung's framework suggests the discomfort was never primarily about ability in the first place. It's about identity, specifically, whether the self quietly believes it has permission to occupy the space the persona has already claimed. This is why gathering more external proof often doesn't help. You can't out-argue a feeling with evidence when the feeling isn't actually a logical position. It's an old, unexamined belief about what you're allowed to become. And beliefs like that don't update through achievement. They update through something closer to direct confrontation, actually examining where the belief came from and whether it still deserves the authority it's been quietly given. If you've noticed that success doesn't seem to touch this feeling the way it should, leave a word in the comments for what you think the feeling is actually about, if not ability. Number 3. The internal voice behind imposter syndrome is often not truly your own. It's a borrowed judgment that got absorbed long before you had any say in the matter. Jung believed that much of what feels like an internal, personal voice of self-doubt was originally external, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that it becomes indistinguishable from your own thinking. A parent's high, unspoken standard. A teacher's offhand comment that stuck longer than it should have. An early environment where being wrong felt genuinely dangerous rather than simply normal. These don't stay in the past. They become an internalized standard, quietly measuring every present achievement against a bar that was never actually yours to meet in the first place. There was a woman I'll call Priya who noticed her imposter feelings intensified, specifically whenever she received praise in front of other people, rather than privately. When she traced this pattern honestly, she recognized the exact shape of an old family dynamic, where visible success had once triggered comparison and resentment rather than celebration. Her current discomfort with public praise wasn't really about her present colleagues at all. It was an old, borrowed rule still quietly running, "Be good, but never too visibly good, because visibility once meant danger. Number 4. Success itself can trigger imposter feelings precisely because it moves you further from an old, familiar self-image that some part of you still trusts more than the new evidence. This is a strange but important mechanism worth understanding directly. The unconscious tends to hold on to an established sense of identity even after that identity has become outdated by real change. If you spent years believing you were, at your core, someone who struggles, someone who's usually behind, someone who has to work twice as hard just to keep up, that belief doesn't automatically dissolve the moment external circumstances improve. It persists, quietly, because familiar identity, even an unflattering one, feels psychologically safer than an unfamiliar one, even a genuinely earned one. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Success, in this light, isn't simply good news. It's a kind of pressure, forcing a quiet negotiation between the old, familiar self-image and the new evidence contradicting it. Imposter syndrome often intensifies right after genuine achievement, precisely because that achievement is what's actually threatening the old identity's grip, not confirming a new one. Number 5. Comparison makes this worse because it measures your fully known inside against everyone else's carefully managed outside. Almost everyone experiencing imposter syndrome eventually falls into the same trap, looking around at peers who seem effortlessly confident and assuming that confidence reflects the whole truth of their inner experience. But what you're actually comparing is deeply asymmetrical. You have complete access to your own doubts, your private uncertainty, every awkward moment of not knowing. You have almost none of that access into anyone else's internal experience, only their persona, the version they've chosen to present. Jung's insight about the persona applies with particular force here. Nearly everyone is managing some version of an acceptable public image, which means the confidence you're comparing yourself against is frequently just as curated as any image you might present yourself. This comparison isn't neutral information. It's structurally rigged to make you feel behind, because you're comparing your unfiltered interior against everyone else's edited exterior, a comparison that was never fair to begin with. Number 6. What actually resolves imposter syndrome isn't proving yourself further. It's allowing the self to finally catch up to the persona, rather than continuing to outrun it. Jung believed genuine psychological maturity comes not from perfecting an external image, but from closing the gap between that image and the self underneath it, a process he called individuation. For imposter syndrome specifically, this means something quieter and less dramatic than most advice suggests. Not gathering more proof, not performing more confidently. Instead, slowing down enough to actually examine the belief running underneath the discomfort, where it came from, whether it was ever really an accurate reflection of your capability, and whether it still deserves the authority it's been unconsciously granted. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For many people caught in this pattern, becoming who they truly are doesn't mean achieving something new. It means finally granting internal permission to be who external reality has already confirmed they are. There was a woman I'll call Solange who described the shift, once it finally happened, not as a dramatic realization, but as something quieter, a moment of simply thinking, "I don't have to keep proving this. It's already true." The external facts of her life hadn't changed in that moment. What changed was that her internal sense of self had finally, gradually, caught up to meet them. This is slow work, not because the insight itself is complicated, but because an old identity, however outdated, doesn't release its grip simply because it's been intellectually understood. It requires repeated, honest attention, noticing the old voice when it arrives, questioning where it actually came from, and gradually allowing new evidence to be trusted instead of quietly dismissed every time it contradicts an old, familiar story. If any part of this reached something you've felt, whether at work, in a relationship, or simply in your own private sense of not quite belonging where you've ended up, share it with someone who might be quietly carrying the same feeling without a name for it. And if you'd like to keep exploring how these patterns actually work beneath the surface, subscribe to the channel. The gap you feel between who you appear to be and who you believe yourself to be was never proof that you don't belong. It was simply proof that the self hasn't finished catching up yet.